He thought the floor would be empty. Noah Pierce stood under the humming light of the executive corridor, toolbox at his feet, a coil of wire looped over his shoulder like a belt. The elevator had spat him out at 22, the building mostly asleep beyond the security desk. The late-night maintenance call was the sort of small, anonymous thing he handled 3, sometimes 4 nights a week. A broken sensor, a flickering exit sign, a stubborn door closer. He had learned to move through glass and chrome with the low posture of someone who belonged to the building's seams rather than its polished surfaces. His hands were numb from the air conditioning. He wiped them on his jeans and checked his phone. A photo of Lily filled the lock screen, her freckles swollen with sleep, a crooked grin from a school picture day. He thumbed the image and felt the familiar notch of panic ease. There were bills to worry about. Rent was due in 2 weeks and the daycare copay had eaten the last of his overtime. But Lily's drawing of a rocket ship, taped to the inside of their apartment door with a strip of mismatched tape, gave him a reason to keep going. He imagined her climbing into bed mid-shift, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and Lily's recorded lullaby on a tiny, scratched speaker. He knocked on the gym door twice before he thought to pause. The sound echoed flat against the corridor. The company had hired a new security firm last month. He'd been told not to go in unless the floor was empty. Still, the light above the door was dead. The sensor wouldn't respond. He knocked again, this time with the heel of his hand, because his other hand carried the stubby flashlight, and the metal strip of his toolbox made his knuckles sing. No answer? He muttered to himself. Probably the lights jamming the sensor. He called out, because that was how he worked. Announce, wait, then act with the measured courtesy of someone enforcing safety. Maintenance, light out, going to check on... There was a sound from inside, quick and private. A chair's creak, the whisper of fabric against skin. He felt a brief human embarrassment at interrupting. Anyone would. He knocked again, harder, the knuckles of a tired man. Hey, sir, ma'am, it's Noah from facilities. No one answered. He turned the knob gently. The door hadn't been locked in years. The latch caught and then gave. He opened the door. The shape in the room moved with the startled speed of being seen in a private moment. Arya Lockhart, the woman whose name was printed in glossy profiles and whose portrait hung by the lobby staircase, caught at a robe that had slid open. She was half-dressed, breath sharp, eyes wide as cameras slapped into phones, and a dozen quietly judgmental faces materialized behind her like theater curtains. Someone screamed. A woman, an assistant in heels, covered her mouth, a phone already in her hand, recording.
For 15 seconds, what happened next suspended like a held breath. The clip, later described as 15 seconds that changed everything, is the sort of thing that fits easily into modern memory. A bright fluorescent frame, Noah frozen with his toolbox in the doorway, Arya's startled face, the sound of someone whose job was to protect image, vocalizing alarm. No one saw him knock twice more. No one saw the tiny flashlight beam sweep the floor. No one heard the small mechanical cough the light wave before it died. What they did see was a man in a doorway and a woman in a robe, and there was nothing in the sequence of those images to tell the truth about intention. The clip left the room faster than Noah could close the door. It landed in phones, in chat threads, on feeds. The sound of the scream was a single jagged note that people fastened their judgments to. It was a clip that fit the world's hunger for simple narratives, one frame for 1,000 assumptions. Noah stepped back and the tool belt clattered against his hip. He heard his own voice make the small, embarrassed apology it always made. I knocked. It came out thin, like a thread pulled through the eye of a needle. Someone laughed, then the cameras jumped. The assistant, after the first instinctive shock, adopted the corporate posture. Phone lifted, angle adjusted. Others gathered, more for the spectacle than the safety. Someone issued an instruction, security. They did not look at his badge. They did not ask his name more than once. The footage, edited down for attention, removed the knocks, removed the seconds of hesitation that would have framed the whole thing differently. Context had a way of being trimmed to fit the appetite of people who wanted to be outraged quickly. By dawn, a version of the clip, cropped, sharpened, captioned with outrage, circulated through the company's internal channels. It moved faster than the building's morning memo. Word spread across departments not as a whisper, but as a gust. Noah's supervisor left him a message at 5:30. You're suspended pending investigation. Do not come on site. He stared at that voicemail in his truck, the fluorescent light of the dashboard making his knuckles look paler than they were. He dialed his manager and heard the careful, rehearsed voice that companies use when they fold human stories into policy. We have to protect people, she said. Please stay home until HR contacts you. He sat on the tailgate and called Lily's phone. Her voicemail clicked on, an automatic recording of their last exchange, a private reassurance he'd left before his shift. "Daddy, don't forget my juice," her voice sang across the speakers, small and pleased. He didn't play it more than once. He couldn't let the sound split his attention. He looked at the faded rocket drawing and thought about the daycare bill this month, the overdue notice for the gas, the slow accumulation of small debts that added up to a big, bruising worry.
The suspension did not bring answers about the clip. It brought economic precarity. Inside the glass towers of the company, Arya Lockhart sat on a couch that swallowed her. The room was a penthouse-lit silence, a place where privacy was measured in square footage, and the staff had learned to compose their faces to match the light. Her phone had not stopped buzzing. For a woman like Arya, precise, swift, used to decisions binding like seatbelts, the clip was a punch to a reputation she had crafted at the edge of her own relentlessness. She watched the loop once, twice, as if repetition might alter perception. Her assistant hovered, offering the expected institutional responses: legal counsel, PR strategy, a memo about conduct. Arya's mouth was a thin line. There was a small, ugly part of her that felt exposed, and an equally sharp part that catalogued the consequences. A CEO's life had no private room unobserved. Even private moments had faces now, and those faces were hungry for significance. She had spent a decade building a brand that measured trust and growth, and the terror of appearing weak sat in her chest like a cold stone. Privately, she replayed the steps she remembered: a light winking out, a visitor on the executive floor. She could remember the slip of a robe and the involuntary scream. She could also remember the second sense that someone had not been threatening, and that offered her no comfort, because instinct and image were at war. She made the first of the decisions that would decide how the story bent. She called HR and demanded clarity and protection. She instructed a brief private statement that emphasized shock and safety. On the surface, the company responded as companies must. Statements were drafted to protect stakeholders. Security footage, when summarized, balanced 1,000 faint cautions. But inside the executive suite, Arya felt guilt tighten around her. The sight of Noah's weathered hands and his badge number flashed in her mind. No one should be surprised at a maintenance worker, she thought. But in the center of her mind, there lay a smaller, less corporate worry. How would this look if the rumor mill followed the clip? How would it look if the simplest parts of her life were interpreted without her consent? She made phone calls to trusted confidants, to the head of communications, to the board liaison. She asked to see full footage. When the raw camera angles arrived, security cam down the hall, the gym's interior feed, she watched them in bright, merciless resolution. She watched a man knock 3 times and then enter a room because the light was dead. She watched herself grasping for a robe and then shout, a quick and human reflex. She felt something like a physical sinking that had nothing to do with PR and everything to do with the human cost of a misunderstanding. And yet there was fear, too. Chief among executives had learned the hard lesson that perception often outpaced truth. Apologizing quickly without control could start a rumor about culpability. Owning vulnerability in public had a political cost as real as any balance sheet. So for now, Arya chose a middle ground: private remorse, public caution. She sent the statement they wanted: firm on safety, blank on admission. Noah watched the world compress into a small apartment with Lily's drawings on the wall. He sat at their tiny kitchen table with bills spread like a deck of unlucky cards. He had worked at that company for years, memorized its pipes and switches the way a person learns the lines of a face they love. Maintenance was a job you did so the people inside could do the work that paid the invoices. He had never one time imagined that stepping into an executive hallway would stoop him into the center of public shame. Neighbors stopped lending small favors. A morning shift buddy who used to ride the bus with him gave an awkward wave and an avoidance that felt heavy as stone. A few social media accounts with a local readership ran the clip with captions that invited outrage. The aggregate effect was a professional and personal squeezing. His phone tilted between dates from HR and messages from debt collectors. Subliminal whispers in the apartment building's lobby suggested that people did not want to be near scandal. Lily noticed the change first in the way small children notice everything. The way her father paused more often when he tucked her in. The way the microwave hummed longer while he pretended to read an email. She asked him once in the kitchen, while he brewed coffee with the practiced hand of someone who woke the house before dawn, "Daddy, are they mad at you?" He said what he always did when the world broke into pieces his daughter could feel. "Not at you, kiddo." He pressed a kiss to her forehead and tried to make his voice steady. He left her a recorded message when he stayed late, a nightly ritual.
"Hi, little star. Daddy's fixing a light, but I'll be home for bedtime, okay? I'm working hard for you." The recording looped on, a thin, stubborn proof that he would fight more than broken circuits for her. Word moved in other channels too. The company's internal chat thread, the one that had nothing to do with security and everything to do with human gossip, filled with the shadow grammar of rumor. People who had never spoken to Noah had opinions about him. The messages were clinical in appearance. HR is reviewing footage, security's looking into it, hope it's cleared up. They were kinder than the public feed, but no kinder than they needed to be. Noah received his suspension notice via a terse email that thanked him for his years of service and offered standard condolences. He could not afford a long, dignified fight. He could not hire a publicist or take the time to correct whatever stitches of narrative had been sewn around his name.
The company called it a pending investigation, a phrase that meant very little and everything at once. His supervisor asked him not to speak to anyone in the building. The effect was immediate. Income paused, benefits uncertain, pride complicated into an irritating relief that felt like shame walking on the soles of his feet. The optics layered on top of practical misery. Tenants who once nodded in the elevator now looked away. A coworker who had once joked about his bad coffee made an awkward comment about protecting the company. Noah learned how fast a man's world could narrow when even the small kindnesses dried up. And beyond the walls of the company, feeds were talking. The clip had entered the broader ecology of outrage where nuance drowned under speed. Noah's name trailed behind the clip in corporate channels, and sometimes in public ones. He read comments not for detail, but to see the pattern of assumption, the quick condemnation, the certainty without evidence. He tried not to let their voices detonate inside him. It didn't always work. Arya's world felt cruelly different, yet braided with the same anxiety. She found herself replaying the footage and feeling the moral itch to write what she had seen. But the board, tight-lipped and cautious, did not want a CEO publicly shunning the only narrative that could be controlled. She met their eyes, men and women who had been leveled by scandals and had learned how to react, with procedures, not apologies. "We have to think about the company," they said. Their tone suggested that a single misunderstanding could metastasize. "We need stability," another added. She left their meeting with an instruction in her ear about legal exposure and shareholder perception. Still, privately, Arya could not shake the double image of Noah, his work jacket, the way he balanced the toolbox on his hip. She thought of her assistant's quick, panicked capture. She thought of the way small human errors could lead to huge consequences. That night, she dreamt about doors that swung open to the wrong faces. The initial public posture hardened. The company's statement emphasized safety protocols and an ongoing review. It said the right things in the right corporate cadence. It did not and could not convey the quiet ache Arya felt watching the man's photo in an article that called the incident disturbing. Noah's days arranged themselves around a single stubborn question. How do you feed a child on a suddenly shaky paycheck? He drafted a request for unemployment and stared at the form until the ink blurred. He called the daycare to ask if there were payment plans. He stacked cans on the kitchen table and tried to make a list of what could be postponed. He bagged lunches for Lily with an economy born of failure, half a sandwich, an apple sliced thin. He lied to her about the bills sometimes, smoothing his voice to flatten worry into the shape of promises. He kept a small stack of receipts in his toolbox, the tape he used for Lily's drawings, a receipt for a winter coat he had bought on sale, a note from the pediatrician about a checkup. Those little things were anchor points in a life otherwise swaying. He kept the tool belt clean as a practice of dignity. The oil stains came out with elbow grease, and the belief that someone with worn hands still deserved respect. At home, Lily asked fewer direct questions and learned instead to monitor the shape of her father's mouth. She watched for the ways he would suddenly hold his breath, for the times he would stare at his phone and then smile in a way that did not reach his eyes. Children are adept at sensing the invisible. She learned the rhythm of worry like a lullaby. A snippet of human decency arrived in the form of an old tenant, Mrs. Calder, who left a casserole at his door and said, "We'll keep a casserole bank, you know. People like to help." Her small act was a counterweight to the gossip. Noah welcomed the food like a benediction. It meant that the world still contained people who understood the cost of small mistakes. And the clip continued to stutter around the internet. By the time the company issued a formal notice, the story had braided into the local feeds. The clip had joined the lexicon of the week. Noah checked the name of the reporter who had used a particular thumbnail and resented, in a way that was both silly and focused, that his face would be cataloged by people who had never held a toolbox for a late-night fix. Arya watched the company respond.
She watched people she had cultivated for years line up behind the policies she had written. She watched the safety net that corporations construct, statements, protections, go into motion. And she felt a small, private dissonance. The system that insulated the business also insulated its actors from human accountability. The procedures were correct, and yet she couldn't escape the feeling that a man's life had been put, briefly and brutally, in the wrong light. On the third day after the clip, a piece of footage surfaced that tried to reclaim the lost seconds. A security camera from down the hall, shot at an awkward angle, showed Noah kneeling at the door, knocking 3 times, then opening it. The raw angle had no glamour. It had scratches where the camera lens had been cleaned poorly, but it had truth. It did not sell well on social feeds. Too many eyes skipped the slow beats for the sharp ones, but it made its way, in a quieter way, into part of the company's conversation. HR filed it. Some employees forwarded the link and wrote one-line messages of support. Others closed the thread without a word. Noah took that clip and did the thing a man with pride and no platform could do. He documented. He wrote down his account in a message to HR, included the knocks, the courtesy he'd offered, the way the light had been dead.
He attached a photograph of Lily's drawing and a copy of the night shift report he'd completed. Administrative details that once felt like paper were now legal lifelines. He waited for the return phone call with the sort of quiet patience of someone used to being let down by systems. The return call came with a voice that was polite and not unkind. "We are reviewing," HR said. "We will be in touch." What they were in touch with for now was the company's need to manage optics. That need is a cold and efficient machine. It closes ranks, it buffers people, it protects reputations. It is also sometimes the very thing that delays a more humane response. In the days that followed, Noah visited the daycare director in the building to ask about sliding payments. The woman, whose name was Denise and who had known Noah from the days when Lily was still a crawled-in-the-corner baby, offered him a look that contained both professional caution and private understanding. "Keep your head up," she told him. "People jump on shapes. They'll forget. They always do." It was the sort of optimism that sounded fragile when he left. He wanted to believe her. For Arya, the pressure calcified into phone calls about investor confidence and a board meeting to discuss potential fallout. The board was not indifferent. They were the sort of people who had learned to measure value in quarterly reports and brand trust. "We must act with prudence," the chair told her. An impulsive move could open the company to criticism. Arya took those words like a physical bruise. In quieter moments, she found herself navigating her own conscience, trying to reconcile what she had seen, Noah's hand on the knob, the light out, with the social consequences that now needed management. She could have, in those early hours, walked forward and said, "This was a misunderstanding." She did not. She conditioned her reaction around a protection of a system that, in many ways, was a second skin she had built for herself. In the middle of this, life continued its petty cruelties. Lily's soccer match went on schedule, with less fanfare than Noah had hoped he could afford. He sat on the curb and watched the ball ricochet across the grass, pretended to pay attention, and let the sound of children laughing press into him as if it were a balm. He recorded his voice telling the story of his day for Lily's sleepy years. She called back 3 times because she loved to hear the sound of him making silly faces through voicemail. He answered each call and answered softly, trying to be the anchor she needed. People can survive rumor for a while. They can stretch a paycheck farther than expected. They can endure a day of humiliation. But all of those small capacities collected into one big pressure when, in the first week, an electrical fault in the building tripped a circuit in the lower mechanical bay.
It was a small technical thing that cascaded into a larger error, a breaker that failed to reset, a failing sensor. The kind of thing Noah worked to prevent, the unspectacular hazard that keeps glass towers from turning into hazards. This time it flickered and then sparked, and then puffs of smoke started into corridors. People in the building barked into phones and sought security. The alarm gave way to a code over the speaker. "Electrical malfunction. Evacuate immediately." Noah heard the sound from his kitchen, where he was patching a hole in the pipe behind the sink in case he could sell the part at the flea market later. For a moment, there is nothing in the world beyond the alarm that exists solely to demand accountability of those who can act. Something raw and old flicked across his face, the kind of instinct that told him where the danger would be. He felt the whole building like a pulse in his chest. He should have stayed home. Policy required a suspended employee to remain off-site. But the building held a daycare, on the second floor, a room full of small chairs and crayon-streaked tables, of afternoon naps and tiny, quiet disasters. His brain measured the costs with a speed that was older than policy. Smoke travels quickly. Toddlers cannot see the way adults can. Exits jam in panic. He didn't have time to make a moral calculus that favored job replacement. He had a 7-year-old daughter with a laughter that stuck to his ribs. He had the memory of a small voice that called him from voicemail begging for juice. The mathematics of fatherhood had its own brutal clarity. He grabbed the toolbox, the very belt of identity that had been the cause of his public humiliation, and ran. He drove across town with the headlights making the rain-streaked windshield look like a moving watercolor. He thought of Lily and Denise's gentle face and the way kids in a daycare cluster like birds, small and bewildered. By the time he reached the building, the smoke was beginning to press against the windows like a hand. People were moving away from the door in confused groups. Security barriers trailed the perimeters. Fire alarms painted everything in a frantic red. Inside, no one stopped him at the lobby doors. Policy evaporates at the face of a man moving with the particular muscle memory of someone who knows the layout of pipes, the compass of breaker rooms. He saw the glow first, the way light refracted through sluicing smoke, and the taste of it on his tongue. He coughed and kept going. He found the daycare door blackened at the edges, the corridor outside thick with the taste of melted plastic. Small shoes lined the hallway like abandoned shells. A teacher, a tall woman with a braid, screamed something about a jammed door, and hands, little hands, pressed to their tiny chests.
Noah hit the door with the back of his shoulder, and then with his shoulder again. Metal shrieked. The lock jarred, but did not give. He wedged the toolbox between the frame and the jamb and pushed, with the same stubbornness he used on stuck pipes. The smell made him sick. Somewhere above, the alarm bled into the sky and made hands turn to look. Inside were 5 children, small and wide-eyed, pressed against a safety mat. Lily sat on the small bench, her mouth a tiny O that Noah knew meant she was holding back the urge to cry. Denise stood in the doorway, barking numbers and small reassurances, but her hands were trembling. He didn't think about the clip this time. He thought about the details that truly mattered. Get them out, now. He scooped up a child with a frozen superhero t-shirt, felt the small weight of his costume sleeve against his palm. He took another by the hand. He felt the warm tug of Lily's little fingers wrap around his wrist like a lifeline. They moved like a small animal train toward the stairwell, the one they always practiced on fire drill days. But the stairwell filled with a smoke density that was wrong, a thick, oily cloud that made breathing like sucking through a wet cloth. Noah covered his mouth with the sleeve of his jacket and pushed forward, feeling his lungs protest the effort. He led them down flights by instinct. He kicked a stuck door with the heel of his boot. He hummed nonsense to Lily because he didn't know how else to tell a child everything would be okay when his own chest felt like someone had folded it with rough hands. Outside the building, a crowd had formed, phones raised in instinctual documentation. Some people shouted for fire crews, others recorded. For a cold second, real life and the clip collided. The man who had been accused of wrongdoing was now a figure in a rescue scene, soot like war paint on his face. Up above, Arya watched through a plate glass pane of her office that overlooked the plaza. She had been at a late meeting, still wearing the stiffness of the boardroom when the first flashing lights began to pulse down below. Her assistant came in, eyes wide, and told her that the lower level had a power issue and that the alarm had been tripped. Arya's chest constricted, not with the reflexive concern she had for the company's assets, but with a personal, savage hope that something hadn't gone wrong where children were. She stood and joined the small cluster of people at the glass. Through the smoke, she saw a figure emerge carrying a child, a man with a toolbox across his shoulder, clothes dark with soot, a small girl clinging to him. For a moment, the world reoriented itself on a single image. The clip, 15 seconds that had folded Noah into a caricature, could not contain this longer, truer moment. A man moving through smoke with small lives in his arms. Arya didn't think in press statements. She thought in a vocabulary that had been rare to her. What is owed?
The board's counsel, the PR scripts, none of them mattered as sharply as the sight of the man whose life had been bent into rumor, now at the center of a rescue. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt, with an immediacy that shocked her, the tide of responsibility which power can confer when it is used not to shield, but to repair. In the ambulance bay, a stretcher waited like a blank promise. Noah collapsed once the children were accounted for, smoke making his laughter cough into a line. He lay with his eyes half closed and Lily's small hand tucked against his shirt, a heartbeat like a warm coin under his heart. Medics hovered, People swirled. Media began to assemble their shots like vultures at a fresh windfall. For the public, the scene would be a series of images that could be arranged however the narrative needed. But in those minutes, something more personal happened. Arya stepped forward from the line of executives and into the space with a long, careful movement that felt both tentative and firm. She walked toward him, past the cluster of corporate-looking people, past the cameras, and spoke his name in a voice that was not for the microphones. "Noah," she said. Her eyes found his like a small apology. He looked up at her, soot smudged on his cheek, Lily asleep against his chest. For a second there was only breath and the complexity of what had come before this, the knock, the door, the clip that had hollowed out his normal life. He did not say anything about it. He did not need to. His body had already said enough. In those minutes, the public narrative stalled, and a different story pushed through the debris. A man had acted without thinking of consequence beyond the safety of children. A CEO had watched, and in the sparked instant when human need was present, had crossed the thin line from corporate posture to personal accountability. It would be days before cameras edited the sequence into headlines that had room for nuance. It would be weeks before HR documents and board memos wrestled with policy and restitution. But in the wet, hot shock of the corridor and the ambulance lights, the shape of what might come next was visible in small human acts. The way Arya's hand stayed too long near his shoulder, the way a security guard looked at his own hands and then at the man on the stretcher, the way Lily's breath smelled of dust and sweat and something that tasted like survival. The world, in its hunger for stories that fit neat categories, trying to settle into a new frame immediately. Hero, survivor, villain. But life is less tidy. It carries the jagged edges of contradiction. Noah's humiliation had not disappeared in the sight of his courage. The clip remained in phones, a stubborn ghost. The financial precarity of a suspended man does not get instantly erased by one rescue. There would be doctor's notes, oxygen masks, an investigation that could not run on sentiment. Noah's chest burned from smoke.
He closed his eyes and felt the weight of the day's development settle in like a new scar. Somewhere above, board members were dialing their counsel. Communications teams were drafting statements that avoided naming individuals. Yet in the ambulance light, in Arya's face, something gentler began to take shape. The first unrefined outline of restitution. This was the hinge. The knock at the gym, the door swinging, the 15-second clip. Those things had broken Noah into public pieces. Now, standing between policy and human need, there was an opportunity for repair that would demand courage in a different vocabulary, the language of admission, of concrete offers, of systemic change that reached beyond a single apology. He did not know that yet. He only knew the taste of smoke and the ache of his lungs and the sound of Lily's small breathing next to him. As medics wheeled him toward the ambulance, Arya followed, not for PR-rehearsed statements, but because something larger than image had lodged itself in her chest, the obligation to use power to protect, to amend, to make something right. Her steps were quick. She did not yet know what she would say in public, nor how the board would react. She only knew she could not let this be the last act. Outside, the night was bright with emergency lights, the colors of red and blue painting the wet pavement. Cameras angled, people murmured. For a man who had been reduced to a 15-second judgment, the night was full of small redeeming acts. For a CEO who had counted every calculation of reputation, the night had handed her a reckoning that no spreadsheet could quantify. Noah's breathing grew steadier when paramedics sat him up and gave him oxygen. He let the cold plastic press against his face and thought of Lily's sticky drawings at home, of how she would climb into bed and insist on a bedtime story about a brave papa who fixed things. He thought of the knocks that no one had seen in the small clip, the way a misread moment could shatter the careful architecture of a life. He did not yet know how this would all end. He only had, in his hand, the small proof that he had run toward what mattered, that he had taken a risk no public feed could strip into a neat soundbite. He would later be named a hero in headlines, and he would also carry the ongoing measure of what had been lost, income halted, reputation bruised, the quiet shape of a child who watched him with new gratitude and a large childlike bewilderment. For Arya, there was the quick flash of clarity that comes when a leader finally understands the perimeter of their duty, that power can be used to punish or to repair, and that the nobler path often asks for both humility and action. She held a small, private shame and a larger, burgeoning resolve. She would have to speak. The night allowed for no easy endings. The rescue changed the picture in a way that made the clip look small and insufficient, but it did not erase it. It offered a pivot. The possibility that the same moment that nearly destroyed someone might also be the hinge for a change that reached beyond the two people in the frame. For now, the ambulance doors closed around Noah, Lily curled against him like a secret. Arya watched them go and felt the foundations of her world shift. The board would want a report, HR would want statements, the press would want an angle. But in the ambulance's thin light, she made a decision that would cost her something, because redemption requires a price and a presence. She would not, could not, let this be only a press release. And somewhere, in a small apartment, Lily's rocket drawing fluttered as a warm breeze blew through a cracked window, waiting for the man who had gone out into the smoke to come home. The knock at the door that had been misread was not yet the whole story. There was more, reports to be written, offers to be made, a board to face, and the future hinged, impossibly and exquisitely, on the next set of choices. Stay until the end to see how that single moment rewrites a life. They wheeled him into the emergency room, and the cameras circled like vultures. The footage of the rescue began to stiffen into a narrative the feeds could understand. Hero rescued children. CEO apologizes. Viral clip overturned. Comments vibrated with the pleasure of a tidy reversal. But in other channels, in HR inboxes, and in the quiet corridors of the company's legal department, a gnawing complexity was already doing its slow, bureaucratic work. Noah coughed and felt hands lift him. Lily's hair smelled like burnt toast and the faint sweetness of a child's shampoo. He saw Denise wipe a tear on her sleeve. He saw Arya standing apart, hands clasped and face set in an expression that was going to ask something of the world. There were cameras. There were people talking. There was the thin, fierce urge to protect his child from whatever came next. The overnight news would extract a simple frame from this mess. Later, op-eds would argue about social media and rush to judgment culture. But in the fluorescent antiseptic light of the ER, in the small ways people behaved when the world was raw and immediate, the truth lay in the fact that a man had risked himself, and a woman had watched, and knew she had to change the way she used her power. The rescue had not yet fixed Noah's bank account. It had not erased the pause in his work record. It had not comforted every neighbor who had turned a blind eye. It had, however, made the world look up long enough to notice that judgments made from 15 seconds of footage rarely held the whole story. When the medic lifted the oxygen mask and murmured instructions, Noah thought about how different people would write the rest of this tale. He thought of his daughter and the way she had trusted him without reservation. He thought of Arya's face, the way she had come close enough to speak his name.
Outside, the company's communication team drafted a new statement. They would not yet go as far as some wanted. They would emphasize the rescue, the ongoing investigation, the company's priority on safety. But the seed of something else had been planted, an awareness that the company could no longer afford to respond only to optics, that human life required more than a scripted statement. Inside, Arya picked up her phone and typed a message that felt like a small, dangerous step. She would call him, she decided, not as a CEO announcing policy, but as a person acknowledging harm. That call, if she made it, would be the first of many decisions that would determine whether the company's reaction would be reparative or merely strategic. Noah dozed between breaths, the kind where half the world becomes soft edges, and he could hear Lily's tiny heartbeat like a metronome for a future that might be rebuilt. The emergency room hummed around him with chords and the quiet march of competent hands. He had been knocked into public life by a single misread moment. Now he moved slowly into a story that might, with stubborn courage and the right people using their power differently, alter things not just for him, but for others like him whose nights were made of small, unseen uniforms. There were hours to come of tests and of interviews, of statements that would be parsed and spun for different audiences. There would be a boardroom and a room of people in suits who would decide on policy and possibly on compensation. There would be moments of graceful admission and moments of obstinate defense. There would be ways to fail and ways to succeed. But in the heat of the night, when the smoke had settled into a fine memory and Lily slept against his chest like a small, indestructible fact, Noah felt the shape of the change that had started. One man acting on the simple human law of protection. One powerful woman confronted with a responsibility that felt heavier than any ledger. That sometimes leadership means stepping into discomfort
and using power to repair what was broken. Arya's call to Noah the next morning was short and careful. She did not script it for cameras. She did not ask for forgiveness as a line to placate. She spoke like a person who had watched a man put his life at risk for children he did not owe. "I need to come by," she said, not for a statement, to say I'm sorry. He let the phone rest on the countertop of his small kitchen for a long moment, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. He pictured the penthouse glass she inhabited, and the distance between that and the stained linoleum beneath his feet. He thought of Lily's sticky drawings, of the way she slept against his shirt. He could have said no. He could have let pride swell in equal measure to the smoke that had filled his lungs. Instead, he said a single word: "Okay." When Arya arrived, she came without an entourage.
She brought a small bouquet, unscripted, slightly formal, and a paper bag with a warm container of soup from the hospital cafeteria. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the apartment's modest light making both of them feel the scale of truth in a different way. Lily watched from the doorway with the guarded curiosity children keep, then slipped away to draw in the other room when adult words began to run thin. Arya did not dress her remorse in euphemism. "I watched the wrong version of what happened," she said, hands folded like a plea. "I saw a clip and I let it shape how I acted. I'm sorry for what that cost you. Your job, your peace. I should have done more to find the whole truth sooner." Noah listened. He had rehearsed his answers in the nights after the clip, some polite rebuke, some quiet acceptance, but what he heard now was not a CEO doing damage control. It was a person owning the fact that her decisions had ripple effects. He felt something in himself loosen, not immediate forgiveness, but enough room to talk. Arya explained what she could offer, not as charity, but as a concrete attempt to make reparations that mattered. She spoke plainly: a senior safety role within the facilities division, a salary that would restore financial stability, comprehensive benefits, and a company-sponsored scholarship fund for children of single parents, seated by the executive team and open to applications through a newly formed foundation. She set out a timeline and said she would support measures to improve working conditions for maintenance staff, better scheduling, a review of hours, and an immediate raise for all hourly maintenance employees. "I want this to be more than words," she said. "I will take it to the board." Noah's response was not triumph or rage, but a measured insistence that the change be broad, not just personal. "If it's about me," he said quietly, "then it won't be enough. Other people like me who keep this place running get overlooked all the time. If you're going to fix something, fix it for everyone who carries the work you count on." That condition could have been brushed aside as bargaining. Instead, Arya pulled out her phone and wrote notes. The small, sharp light of her screen reflected on the countertop like a promise. "I don't want to repair only one life," she said. "I want to change the way we respond when someone is harmed by a rush to judgment. I need you to tell me what that looks like." They built the frame together in that cramped kitchen. A job offer to Noah with the title of Senior Safety Manager, a commitment to institute an immediate raise and revise schedules for maintenance staff, a scholarship fund with guidelines drafted by a committee including maintenance employees, and a public apology that would name Noah and acknowledge the company's failure to see the whole truth. There was no merchandised flourish, no staged confessional.
There were signatures to be sought, human resources forms to be drafted, and a board to convince. The boardroom presented the first real test. Arya called the meeting with a steady voice that carried the weight of a leader willing to put her reputation on the line. She walked into a room of suits and calm expressions shaped by years of shareholder briefings and risk analysis. The chair opened the floor with a neutral tone. "We need to hear your recommendation." She spoke clearly, without drama. She explained the facts as she now understood them. She described what had happened in the building that night, the rescue, and the intervening days of damage. She presented the plan, not as a confession to erase legal exposure, but as a strategy to restore dignity and trust. "We have to choose how we use our power," she said. "We can protect a narrative, or we can protect people. If we choose people, our brand benefits eventually. If we choose the opposite, we risk the culture and the safety of those who keep us functioning." There were questions, sharp, measured, sometimes thinly veiled doubts. "Are we setting a precedent?" asked one board member. "What about liability?" another probed. Arya answered with a mixture of practical detail and moral clarity. She asked for a pilot program, for financial projections on morale-driven productivity gains, for an initial fund allocation for the scholarship, and for an immediate payroll adjustment for maintenance staff. She did not ignore risk. She reframed it as a managed investment in stability and dignity. At a crucial moment, someone suggested a compromise: meet Noah privately, offer a gesture, and keep the public statement minimal. Arya refused that path. "We could hide," she said evenly, "or we can model a better response for other companies. I am willing to stake my leadership on that choice." The sentence landed like a small, deliberate reckoning. She was not asking permission to be moral. She was offering to be accountable for it. The vote was not unanimous, but it passed. A handful of members pushed for tighter guardrails. Others, moved by the rescue footage and the prospect of a culture that cared for the hands that kept the business functioning, sided with her. The company agreed to the package: Noah's rehiring with the proposed role, immediate raises for maintenance, the scholarship fund, and a public apology that would acknowledge the company's misstep. When the statement went live, it was direct in a way corporate statements seldom are. Arya stood before a small bank of cameras in the company atrium and spoke to a crowd that expected calibrated language. "We made a mistake in how we addressed an incident," she said. "A misunderstanding caused harm. We failed to see the full context and people suffered. Today we offer our apology to Noah Pierce and to all those affected. We will be taking concrete steps to ensure our teams are protected, heard, and compensated. We will do better." She named Noah.
The naming mattered. The apology was not an "if anyone was offended," it was an explicit admission that the company had erred and an outline of reparative action. It was brief, accountable, and followed by a release with details about the scholarship and the staff-wide changes. Social feeds hummed with reaction, some skeptical, some hopeful, but within the building, a real shift began to take hold. People who had been hesitant to comment began to send messages of support. Maintenance workers who had felt invisible received emails explaining the raise and the new scheduling options. Noah's first day back at the company was not a parade, it was a shift. He walked through a lobby that had a different kind of attention now, not the spotlight of spectacle, but the cautious warmth that follows accountability. He met with HR and signed paperwork that restored his employment status. He accepted the Senior Safety Manager title not as a coronation, but as a platform to make things better for colleagues who had been overlooked. He insisted on a seat at the table when the Scholarship Funds Committee met, and he worked with Arya and HR to draft guidelines that prioritized children of single parents and those in the facility staff. The raise for maintenance staff changed more than bank balances. It changed schedules in a way that respected lives outside the building: less arbitrary night shifts, clearer overtime protocols, and a health review for those with repeated exposure to hazard. It was not an instant cure for every systemic problem, but it was a structural fix born of a concrete injustice and the desire to correct it. There were days after when the conversation swelled and then receded. Some employees grumbled about optics, others used the moment to press for other reforms. The Scholarship Fund received its first applications that winter, handwritten letters from parents who described sleepless nights and second jobs, and the committee awarded the inaugural grant to a single mother in the mailroom whose son wanted to study robotics. Noah did not become a celebrity in the way headlines imply. He became instead a person whose work had new weight. He sometimes walked the corridors with the same quiet posture as before, toolbox gone, replaced by a tablet and a safety vest, and he answered questions about protocols and about human dignity in ways that felt modest and earned. Arya continued to steward the company, but her leadership now carried the residue of that night. She called regularly to check in, not as a superior surveying performance, but as someone who wanted to know whether the fixes were working. There were awkward moments. Lily's classmates had seen the headlines. Some wondered why a woman like Arya was at their play. She attended as a private guest, sitting not front and center, but at the side with a small smile.
When Lily's name lit up on the stage and she marched out with a paper crown, Noah's chest swelled with a relief that had nothing to do with press cycles. After the show, the three of them, Noah, Lily, and Arya, walked out into the cooling air to light chatter. Arya applauded a little harder than anyone else. Noah's face was flush with pride. The moment felt simple and true: a father watching his child, and two adults bound by a shared, complicated history. Over months, routines settled into new grooves. On a Saturday in late spring, they met at a park playground. Lily clambered up a slide while Noah watched, hands resting on the railing as if to steady himself against old worries. Arya sat on a bench with a thermos and a worn paperback, laughing at Lily's insistence that she be the queen of the swing. Conversation moved easily in the small pauses between pushes on the swing, the kind of conversation that comes when people are no longer only headlines to each other. People's impressions did not all change overnight. There were those who remained angry about the original incident or suspicious of media spin. Some board members continued to critique the decision in private memos. That was part of the truth. Not every wrong can be fully mended, and not every reputation can be restored to its unscarred original. But the company had chosen a path that put repair into action rather than only words, and that choice altered conditions for many employees. For Noah, the genuine change was less about salary numbers and more about being seen enough that policy could shift. He took his new role seriously, conducting inspections, mentoring newer maintenance staff, and leading safety drills that now included candid talk about how quick judgments can harm lives. He used the scholarship committee meetings to remind the company of the real people behind the spreadsheets. He still carried scars, the subtle flinch when someone lifted a phone too quickly, the memory of nights when neighbors looked away. But those were joined by new proofs: Lily's stable school routine, his steadier paycheck, and the occasional hand on his shoulder from coworkers who knew what it was to be overlooked. Arya's leadership did not become sainthood. She still navigated shareholder concerns and growth metrics, but the experience changed how she allocated attention. She championed initiatives that looked after frontline workers and pushed for a communications policy that emphasized context before judgment. She learned the uncomfortable lesson that protecting a brand at all costs sometimes protected bad culture, and she began to measure success not only in profits, but in the quiet metrics of dignity. Months later, during an internal town hall, Arya stood at a podium and told a room full of employees she had once let the shortest narrative lead the response to a human incident. She said the right thing, that she had been wrong, and then she named the policy changes and the outcomes.
Noah sat in the front row, his back straight, his